Welcome everyone. This is our inaugural pilot event of New York Heritage Bits and Bytes. We're intending this to be a series of webinars that will focus on some of the behind the scenes work that happens to put up collections into New York Heritage digital collections. And we hope this is interesting. We're going to try to keep it a relatively brief event and keep it concise and to the point. We had not intended for this to be at the same time as the inauguration. I guess let's chalk that up to lessons learned from a pilot event. Next one will not be during a presidential inauguration, I can assure you of that, or hopefully, I can't imagine. So first I'll introduce myself. My name is Ryan Perry. I'm the Digital Collections Librarian at the Central New York Library Resources Council. And I'm also the statewide project coordinator for New York Heritage. So I do some of the local stuff and some of the statewide stuff. Our first person featured on this series is Claire Lovell. She is not only the recently hired digital services librarian for the South Central Regional Library Council. She's also on the board for the Manlius Historical Society. So she's going to be speaking in her role as the ladder of on the Historical Society. And I'll let Claire introduce herself further if she has anything beyond that to say, and we can get right to it.
Hi, everybody. I am Claire Lovell. I used to have Ryan's job under the name Claire Ankoski. And after I left CLRC, I went into public libraries. I worked for Manlius Library in Manlius, New York, a suburb on the eastern side of Syracuse, a lovely town. And that library doesn't have a local history department or room or really anything about local history. It's like very much a suburban library that has 18 copies of every John Grisham book, but not historical artifacts. Our neighbor, Fayetteville Free Library, has a wonderful local history collection. So we mostly either handed things off to them or to the Manlius Historical Society, which is really only a couple blocks away and encompasses the entire town of Manlius, whereas we were really just a village. So I ingratiated myself upon the Historical Society. My position at Manlius Library was public services librarian, which meant that I did kind of a little bit of everything. And I pushed local history into my agenda. So we did have some yearbooks, but it was like an accidental collection housed in a corner. It's sort of treated like a reference collection. And as is prone to happen in a public library, people had helped themselves to it sometimes and maybe cut out the pictures they wanted. So like that was our local history collection of these yearbooks. Manlius is very well off, like generally. There's of course a spectrum of demographics there, but it's an affluent town. A lot of professors and doctors work there, and a lot of people aren't like multi-generational Manlius residents. Not to say that there aren't some, but that's certainly the impression of the village I got when I first got there. Which made the yearbooks seem like something really valuable to get online, because a lot of people who had grown up in Manlius did not live in Manlius. Like in fact, the age, like a normal age chart of a place would be like a bell curve like this, but Manlius is like little kids in school and their parents. And there's no like 20-year-olds. So let's get the yearbooks online so that people can go look at them from wherever they've scattered with their excellent Manlius degrees. So having had Ryan's job, I knew that places like CLRC offered these great digitization grants. So on behalf of Manlius Library, I applied for one to digitize all of these yearbooks. And since we didn't have a complete collection and we didn't have complete non-defaced yearbooks in many cases, I walked to the Historical Society a block away and said, hey guys, do you have the rest of these yearbooks? And that is how a relationship was made. So we got the grant, we paid a library page to scan them. And and we put them online and it was great. What else do I talk about? Do you want to guide this? I mean, I'm just going to ramble, really.
Yeah. So my first question was describe the partnerships that made your collection possible. And I know I saw some comments as people were registering for this webinar that were very interested in that relationship between the library and the Historical Society. So you talked a little bit about how that started. Can you talk a little bit more about how that blossomed, if that makes sense, or how that how that built up beyond the yearbooks into some other projects?
I would say, and this will probably not surprise anyone who has considered starting a relationship, that you have to, I'm a very nervous person, but you have to put that all aside and be very confident and say, I want to do work for you on your behalf. Therefore, we collaborate. And that is how you found a relationship. So largely, the relationship that existed between the library and the Historical Society was based on what Claire was willing to do with her time and what her director, my director, was willing to sign off on letting me do. So when I put work into something, it either had to be clearly for the library's benefit. So like, I'm going to make a public program, as is my job at the library, and I will base it on this historical collection. Therefore, it's a collaboration, and we bring in the Historical Society. The Historical Society, not unlike a lot of historical societies, had a lot of turnover. You know, they don't have a great funding stream. They don't have a lot of money. I think we went through like three directors in a 5-year period, something like that. Pretty typical.
So in a sense, you were the olive branch. It wasn't just that you went to Manlius Historical Society and said, I'd like to do something with you. You also took of your time and worked on behalf of the Historical Society. So you were the bridge in that you're on the board of the Historical Society. You got yourself very involved there. It wasn't just a service level relationship. You jumped right in. And I know you've done that for other organizations, and you've gotten involved in other organizations in similar ways. And I think that as an outsider, maybe you take it for granted, but I think that's one of the values in what you were able to do. You weren't just kind of pushing work on the Historical Society. You were kind of going and helping them do the work.
Yeah, can't emphasize that enough. Like, pretty routinely, I would do something where all of the work was my work, which is totally fine with me. And I would say, this is a collaboration between these two organizations, one of which pays me. And I really like this other one, and I hope that it does well. I think that is, if you're willing to look at the big picture, that's beneficial for everyone. Because we want the Historical Society to do well, and they don't have a lot of money to promote themselves. And of course, every single time I talked to someone there, like 5 different people in charge over the years that I did this, they want to have a relationship too. Like, everybody wants to have a partnership. Everybody wants like a copacetic cross-promotional relationship, but that requires at least someone to do work. And it helps if I'm able to say, I will get you money, we can do grants.
That's where I was going to lead. You also helped work between the library and the Historical Society to get what we here at CLRC now refer to as our access and digitization grants, but elsewhere around the state they're referred to by RBDB grants or other names. But you were able to get funding to do the projects and do that through a partnership between the both organizations.
I will say too. Yeah, I see the question, and I'm happy to answer it. But on the relationship question, oh my gosh, I lost my train of thought. Never mind. Intellectual properties. So the first thing I did was the yearbooks. And so if you ever do a yearbook, not only do you need to make sure you have the permission of the school department, hopefully in writing, and lesson learned, print it, because it exists in an email account that no longer exists. So I have an email from someone from the Fayetteville Manlius School Department, but it went to clareandkoski@manliuslibrary.org. That's not a thing anymore. And it probably CC'd the former director of the library, which wouldn't exist anymore. So be more careful than I was in that regard. You also, with yearbooks, you need to double check that like Jostens, a really popular yearbook publisher, did not put the kibosh on digitizing, which they have in more recent decades. Most of what we were looking at, because scanning yearbooks takes forever, especially with like a flat top scanner, which is what we had, and OCRing was maybe not so ideal 6 years ago when we did this. The collection that we actually got online was like one every 4 or 5 years. So it was pretty likely if you went to FM that at least one of your year's yearbooks would be online, but maybe not all 4, maybe not like 67, 68, 69, 70. And I think right now, actually, the library is applying for another grant to like fill out the collection with my predecessor bill. Yes.
Yeah, they're working to complete the yearbook collection.
Yeah. And
so
that was before I was on the board. This was just as the library. And this is a relationship thing. So the Manlius Historical Society was not a member of the Library Council, but the library was. So the library was eligible for this grant, which made it all the easier for me to strut in there and be like, hey, I can get you some money. Do you want to be friends? Because they couldn't do that on their own.
And disclaimer there, each of the 9 library councils throughout the state operates a little bit differently, so that might not fly in every region, but in CLRC's region in central New York, that is something we encourage. I want to shift to my next set of questions, and those are about how you promoted your collections and what your approach to outreach was.
Pretty typical stuff. If you've ever worked in a library, you know you have like one of those magazine racks full of postcards and bookmarks that always looks messy. We had a lot of those. We would have like stacks of things at the front desk if I remember to put them out. If you work in a big cooperative group like New York Heritage, then they will almost certainly hand you a stack of postcards or a stack of bookmarks for you. And I would get those from CLRC and then I would put them out. In the same way that you would do customer service and promote any other service. If someone comes up to the desk and asks you a reference question about any kind of history, you'd be like, hey, by the way, did you know that this is here? And you push yourself out there and you sell New York Heritage and the collection that you invested time in. And anytime, so I noticed Sue Greenhagen was on the attendees list. She's an excellent local historian. She and her sister would do programs and we would hire her at Manlius Library. And right before her presentation, you know, when you do your housekeeping introduction, I would say, and by the way, if you care about local history, which I assume you do since you're here, check out this collection online. Yeah.
You also did a fair amount of outreach through social media, if I remember,
Yes.
in terms of posting and asking questions of your community there, which I thought was, from what I saw, was very effective.
Yes. So Ryan's talking about a particularly funny picture that I'll show you. So we did 4 collections, 4 grant-funded projects through CLRC. First was the yearbook, and then 2 years worth of grants went toward like basically street views, the general photo collection of Manlius that the Historical Society has. And then the 4th one was a literary magazine that the high school created. And that was intended to be done and then have like a full in-person gala kind of event when that was finished. But of course, that overlapped with pandemic. It didn't work out, but there's still hope in the future. But with those street views, I am not from Central New York. I really don't know Manlius very well. So anything I was able to do was all done through personal research. And while there's a lot of like homegrown, awesome resources about Manlius in like smattering places like Roots Web and the town historian, Barbara Rivette, who's been the town historian for like literally 4 decades, maybe more. She had filled out an application for the National Historic Register. So you can find this very lengthy, very thorough application telling you the details of all these places, which is online and publicly available. But when you go through like a general photo collection, you will find random photos that no historic application is going to explain to you. So I'm going to share my screen. So hopefully you guys are looking at, nope, this isn't, I can't even tell now. Oh gosh. Ryan, I failed. Mute screen, right? Are you looking
You
at a
see
Facebook
the Facebook page where I lived in.
Perfect. It doesn't have the line around it, so I panicked.
Yeah, they took that away sometimes. It's really frustrating because it does give you that.
I hate change.
But we can see it.
So what you should be seeing right now is a Facebook page called I Lived in Manlius or Fayetteville, New York. And from my experience, every town has a variation of this group, like the I used to live here, I do live here group. Perfect. Thank you, Susan. And it's got thousands of members of people who are somehow affiliated with Manlius. And this is a great place to find identification stuff, especially for the 20th century. So in the collection, here's a fun picture: roasted chicken, roasted seafood. It's very interesting, but it's not clear where it is or what it is or why it was in the general photo collection of the Manlius Historical Society as like a historically significant picture. So I just posted it. And again, this like requires a little more confidence than I naturally have to be like, hey, I'm a dummy. I don't know what this is. Does anyone know what this roasted chicken hut is? And sure enough, I got up 226 comments. Now, if anyone's been on Facebook before, you can probably guess that the last 200 of those comments repeated what the first 26 said, but still it was such a great font of information. And it got a lot of attention for the Historical Society and the library just by saying, hey, what is this? We have a collection. We want to know what it is. Can we talk about history for a second? So, I mean, we got people who were like, I used to work there in the 70s, and like, here are the owners and here are their children and here's where they went. And it was super sweet to see. Since then, the current director will like routinely post pictures just to drum up attention, which I think a lot of historical societies know to do. But this was a particularly good example of lots of comments for actual information and identification.
So I can't remember exactly what is roasted chicken and seafood.
I can't remember either.
Okay, it wasn't anything particularly unique about it, just a unique name, right? Like
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and the building is no longer there. Manlius has a lot of these buildings that went down, but that's why it was all the more interesting to know where it was. And it's next to the Swan Pond, which is like an iconic spot in Manlius. So it was very cute. So that's the story.
And this leads in part to my last set of questions, which were about, if you could describe any interesting objects or discoveries from working in the collection.
Well, beyond roasted chicken, which is a cool topic. So one of the ways that I tried to throw myself into the local history relationship was creating a public program about local history as someone who did not know Manlius local history very well. And because we had so many street view photos, like someone in the 60s, in 1965, somebody walked down Seneca Street of Manlius and just took pictures all the way down. And then you can like flesh those out with all of these other pictures that just happened to end up in the collection. And this is one of the ways that I pointedly tried to promote the local history collection that was online by doing a public program and bringing people in person to look at the photos. But it did take a whole lot of work. So let's see, oh, that's on the wrong screen. Okay, so I made a PowerPoint presentation. This is the most recent one that I did for Staff Development Day, but I sorted all of these street views and lined them up with a map. So it was a fun game to like go find a historic map and show like, here's the street that everybody knows, because especially with local history, like that relationship between space and place really ties people together. Like they can understand that this street that they have seen every single day for the last 15 years used to look different. And I would say that old timers especially love to see pictures from their childhood and like reimagine and revisit that place in their mind. So by endless research, like putting up a map and and saying, okay, we're gonna start at this intersection that everybody recognizes, and we can all orient ourselves and like walk down the street and point out where the different things used to be and where the things still are. So that's where I found most of the interesting stuff by this painstaking research of going through. So for example, if you've ever been to Manlius, you might know that there is a rather unattractive building at the so-called point. So here was the slide that I put together to emphasize this, like Bank of America building, except that Bank of America left, and it's a bunch of very strange angles, and it's in like the focal point of the town, but it used to be this beautiful Victorian house owned by a man of importance back in the 19th century. So by tying the changes in the space together, I could tell all of these interesting stories along the way. Like Manlius used to be a manufacturing spot, and we had these fancy little faucets. These would probably not be interesting to like the people listening right now, but to anyone who was familiar with Manlius, of course, this was like thrilling stuff. Like, hey, I remember that factory right there. Here's a picture of it from 1963. The iconic ice cream shop, everybody loves to see that. And you can see that it was like literally walking down a street saying, okay, now we're back on Fayette Street. Look to your left, here's what you see. Lots of work, but I have to say totally worth it. And there was a lot of detective work behind it too, because a lot of buildings change, and as I think we're all familiar, maybe the information written on photographs at the Historical Society were not like the most correct or full or comprehensive. So there's a lot of detective work. So I narrowed it down, and for an hour-long program, which I don't think was that boring. If anyone attended, I hope they seemed like they liked it okay. I was only able to like go 2 blocks down one street and then 2 blocks up another street, because we had enough stuff and there were enough little vignettes to share. And I guess I'm a rambler, that filled up the whole time. So if you have a good general photo collection, I would fully recommend trying this in your public space or Zoom. But are we all here to learn about the murder story?
Yeah, I was wondering if you were going to transition to that.
Yes, yes.
You teased it in our previous conversation when we were planning this.
So there's the highlights of this virtual tour of Manlius is like the house at the point, which is now a Bank of America. That house, by the way, was picked up in the 80s and moved over, which is, I don't understand how that works, but it was very cool. That's not the only building that was moved, because at the significant intersection of the village was Arley's Hotel. You can see this giant building is Arley's, and that's Arley's. It is not there anymore. It is across the street, which is crazy. How do you move a building? But they did it. And then it was a super cool find that we had pictures of moving day. Right. So then you go up Seneca Street and you're walking along. I'm talking about floods. Every town has events like this. Notable figures. It's fun. It's fun to do this research. It's fun to show people, like, this is a picture from inside a glove factory. And then as we get to the top of the street, you will see this building, which is not a remarkable building. It'd be easy to miss the fact that this is even a historic building. But in fact, this was the Fasto's building, named for Frank Fasto, the grocer and ice cream shop parlor owner. Here's the story. Okay, which I just stumbled upon because nobody had ever shared this story with me before. Right? This building, this long stretch of a building right here, the beige one with a faux stone facade, had apartments on top, and it had Frank Fasto's like grocery store and ice cream parlor in the front. Here's that shot. So in the lurid kind of reporting style of the 1920s, we can read this whole story. In 1922, Frank Fasto was minding his own business, running his grocery store, when suddenly Rosa Viandante, who lived upstairs, came running into the grocery store with customers there, screaming, "He kill me, he kill me." Then her husband came running in after her. She had run into the back room where Frank Vasto, his brother working in the front, was in the back room lying down with his broken leg because he happened to have a broken leg and was convalescing. Rosa runs into his room. Her husband follows suit, but like grabs the butcher's knife from the butcher's block. This is all written down in the newspaper. So this, like, I'm basically retelling what you could read in the newspaper in the same style of drama. So this guy, I forget his name already, Viandante. He pulls the butcher's knife. He runs into this back room. Frank Vasto, despite his broken leg, had jumped up between Rosa and her husband to like block the violence, and he was murdered for that. And then the wife was also tragically murdered. So Viandante was on the lam for like a couple days, caught, and put on trial and found very guilty because it was very public. The first few articles right away were like, poor Frank Vasto, like he obviously wasn't involved. But 2 years later, when Viandante is on he's waiting for the electric chair. It was really funny to come across this article where he was really salty about the whole thing and was all indignant that, you know, back in the old country, I would not be in trouble for this. And he tried to claim after the fact that there had been salacious.
Impropriety.
Yeah, right. Like there had been some kind of affair between Rosa and Frank, even though in 1922, when the murder actually happened, it was very publicly clear that there was no such relationship. Poor Frank was just being a good Samaritan and was murdered for it. So this is not a very Manlius-like story, which made it all the more exciting because this is not the kind of story that Manlius is known for. It was really fun to tell.
Yeah, I mean, it's especially the drama of it, of course.
Yeah.
And you know, when you're pouring through a bunch of photographs along a street, then that might also jump out, especially because it's a little more dramatic than Manlius tended to be even now. So on a higher note, and then I want to make sure we have a few minutes for questions. Patricia Dalton gave in the chat more of a description of roasted chicken. I knew there was something to it. I just couldn't remember the details. But it is a patented process that combines deep frying and pressure cooking. So I feel like maybe there's going to be an instant pot revival of roasting or something. You know, with all that going on these days. We were intending for this to run about a half an hour, and we're running up against that time, but we can stay on for a little bit and take questions if there's any questions, or if there's anything that folks would like Claire to speak about in more detail, or anything at all, really.
I believe it is the director of Manlius Historical Society now is Linda Bailey, but we have not had a board meeting in quite a while because of COVID. So she's still the one I communicate with. Before that, it was Chris Malmgren who did a lot of the work on the grants. In fact, part of the way we wrote the grant application and made it a convincing pitch was like, Chris, the director, needs more organizational knowledge of local history. So please pay for that as she does this work. But then she left.
Yeah, it's hard at a lot of small historical societies. You know, it's a demanding job, often on a small budget, and we understand that there's a lot going on. So that's where whenever the library councils are able to help out, especially the smaller organizations, that's really I know personally I get a lot of satisfaction with being able to help in some small way some of these smaller organizations, because it's not easy, especially right now. And but having those partnerships also means you're not doing it alone as well.
To answer Zachary, no, we did not have a digitization plan before these projects began. Manlius Library is and was very well renowned for having an excellent youth services department, and it's just a very busy, popular reading section kind of suburban library. no emphasis on local history. It's just not the kind of library it was.
Yeah, I think that that's what makes the story, I think, compelling, because there are a lot of libraries that they might have a small vertical file of some newspaper clippings, but building the partnerships kind of allows you to leverage those organizations. Could be a historical society, also could be municipal offices sometimes, are willing to work with libraries to do some of this work.
So it depends which part of the project it is. So basically this is like a 5-part project made of all of these different projects. The yearbook digitization took hundreds of hours in 2014 and will take hundreds more hours in 2021 by other people who are not me. The photo scanning, I think that Chris Malmgren, who had been the director at the time, I think she was budgeted to do 100 hours per grant cycle. So probably about 200 hours in scanning and transcribing the back of postcards with whatever captions they have, and putting them on New York Heritage. And then the project of me putting together a so-called virtual tour, conservatively, I would say that was probably 80 hours. But a lot of it was like personal interests. Like I would go on familysearch.org, that genealogy site, and I would look up individuals, and that's how I found the Frank Vasto story, because it happened to be connected. And you could look through Google Books for some of these names and find cute vignettes. Not cute, but interesting.
We have a couple questions in the question and answer module that have come through as well, Claire. So I can ask you the first one out loud. How has Manlius been able to raise funds during the pandemic?
Not so much. I mean, there's an annual appeal as ever. Manlius Historical Society is more fortunate than a lot of other historical societies because it's the town of Manlius Historical Society, which means that we have gone, well, the president of the board, Mike Small, went and asked the village of Fayetteville for some support, and they gave him some every year. And he went to the village of Manoa, and they didn't. And he went to the village of Manlius, and I think they might have. And then he went to the town of Manlius. Like there was more than one municipality that he could be like, please, just a little bit. And that comprises like half the annual budget. And then old movies, yes. Do you want to answer this?
Yeah, I can tackle that one. I think this completely depends on how old were we talking. So there's a question, can old movies be added to New York Heritage? Where do your grants come from? So I'll answer that first one first. January 1st this year was a special day in that everything, we added a whole nother year to the public domain. So currently everything before 1926 is in the public domain. So that means that old films that were commercially produced and made public would fall under that. So anything 1925 and earlier is public domain. Anything can be done with it in theory. Where it gets trickier is whether they weren't published in that they weren't like released. So if you're referring to like home movie kind of stuff, then that would we would have to look at it more on an individual basis, but that might fall more under the rules for unpublished materials, which would be 70 years after the creator's death. So that's more of a case-by-case basis.
Or with their permission.
Yes. So you get permission. So that from a copyright standpoint, yes, but you would need to have permission or have it be in the public domain. From a technical standpoint of whether Content DM, which is a software that runs behind New York Heritage, can handle videos, then the answer is yes. We do have some video content in the repository. I would often duplicate that content. So I would put it up in another repository as well and have an alternative link. So if Content DM has, or if a user, if somebody visiting your materials has trouble viewing the video, they could go to an external link to YouTube or Internet Archive and have a little bit of backup there. Technology that's a little bit better at handling lower bandwidths. Where do your grants come from? So the 9 library councils, 8 of which who participate in New York Heritage, so basically every region of the state except for Westchester and New York City, we all handle the grant funds that we receive from the state differently, but we all receive what's referred to as RBDB funding, which is Regional Bibliographic Database grants, which is money that's intended to help promote access to materials in New York State. When it was written, and that title means something completely different than what it is today, but a lot of that is money that's earmarked in the funding that we get from the state to help us make things available as widely as possible. Some of that, some of the councils, I would say maybe even the majority of the councils, offer that as direct grants to our members. Other councils don't do it directly. They might offer other services that uses that pool of money. And I see some other questions in chat.
I'm going to answer Jane's because that is a simpler one on the topic of New York Heritage as infrastructure. Yep. New York Heritage is a website hosted by the library councils where hundreds of little organizations and big organizations like Manlius Historical Society and Manlius Library can upload their images. So you go to one site, newyorkheritage.org, and could look up Manlius, and you won't just find our stuff. You'll find things that maybe Fayetteville Library uploaded, or maybe Onondaga County Public Library did. So we link to it. And in fact, it is really important and cannot be overstated, the value of the contributing organization linking out to the digital collection and saying, look at this, look at your local history here. Right, so the Manlius Library has a whole little local history page where we link out to those collections and describe what they are and give credit to the grant funder, and also link out to like that National Historic Register application from the 70s about the village and a couple of other things, like a lot of public libraries would. Then for Elizabeth's question, have you ever invited library patrons who grew up in town or are descendants of local families to lend relevant family photos? We have, and we have gotten 0. I say we, they, Manlius Library. I don't work there anymore. Yes, that it always breaks my heart, but a lot of times public librarians will be like, I have this brilliant idea, and we will crowdsource local history, and the participation levels are not big, which is fine. But in doing the public program and being like, come to this virtual tour and like relive local history, in that case, we did get some elderly people who told me like the most incredible stories, and I would like integrate them into the talk for the next time, because I think I gave that same presentation 3 times. It was a crowd pleaser.
Yeah, I think you're right, Claire. I think I've heard a lot. There's been a lot of proposals for community digitization projects where you invite people in and say, come bring your old photographs, we'll scan them. I can think of a few that were successful in doing that, but it's definitely harder than it sounds in theory. And there's definitely, you need to do a lot of like outreach, and it's certainly not a build it and they will come kind of experience. So,
and plus, when you do that, when you do that kind of event, it's really hard to serve as a curator. I've been in events like that, like specifically a Black Syracuse Project event, where we tried to collect this underrepresented history of African Americans in the middle of Syracuse. And it's not that like the point of the project wasn't clear, but people came in with like a 1975 copy of Ebony. Well, that's not what we wanted. And then it's sad to make them sad. You don't want that conversation. So it's better if you can curate things ahead of time to make really clear distinctions of what you're looking for. Like, does anyone have a picture of this street? Do you have more information about this? Not just like a picture of random people who you think were in Manlius maybe during this multi-decade span, but we want names and we want details because that's what's beneficial. The Manlius Library did have a couple of successful oral history programs specifically about veterans. So they were called Local Heroes, Local Stories, and working with the Senior Center, we identified a couple of Manlius residents who we knew had served, and we had them come in on a 2 or 3 person panel. And that was very successful and very sweet too.
That's great advice to ask for specific things. I think it's hard to balance and find that intersection between what people as individuals think are really important and what maybe a broader audience might see as important. It's you know, you don't want to be the one to tell them that the picture of their old bookcase is not historically relevant, but it might mean so much to them.
Which a historical society is well familiar with anytime someone drops off a donation, which is well-meaning, but.
So there was a question about, oh, sorry.
What does that mean? Somebody raised a hand. Did you see that?
Oh, I did. Yeah. Michael Walsh raised his hand. If you could send us write something in chat or Q&A, then we can know what you're going for. I don't really know if I have the ability to unmute somebody right now, and oh, sorry, mistake. Okay, cool. All right. So going back to a question in chat from Jane. Does New York Heritage offer their services to all libraries and historical societies in New York or just Western New York area? My library is in the Adirondacks. So yes, all regions except for Westchester County and metropolitan New York, or the New York City 5 boroughs are participating in New York Heritage. So if you go on the New York Heritage website, there's a link to, I believe it's under the About menu, to for information how to join. So that gives you your contact. Christy Sommerfeld is the person who handles the Northern New York region. Assuming you're in the Northern Adirondacks, if you're closer to the Capital region, then you might be in the Capital District Library Council region, which is Susan D'Entremont, who I know I saw a comment earlier, so she's on this call. So yes, you can reach out and talk through what it would look like to participate. And
Leslie's question, what about mining the community? So as she suggested, visiting places of worship, boards of education, American Legion, and copying old photos. Has outreach been done this way? Outreach was not done successfully at Manlius in that way, but I mean, that could be a personal failure of mine. I did reach out to the American Legion in Manlius because they kind of closed, like they closed, but then 2 years later they did reopen, or at least I've noticed that they were open since then. And I talked to him about collecting stuff, and it just didn't go anywhere. In the case of Manlius, there was enough material that deserved to be done at the Historical Society, which is basically low-hanging fruit if you have a grant application and someone willing to do the work, that we didn't have to go out to collect yet. But I would fully recommend anyone doing that, and it's a great idea.
Yeah, and I think that gets to some of the points you were making earlier, where there's you have to balance and see it as an outreach and building those community connections. I think I have seen some good examples of people reaching out and partnering with these kind of organizations. There's a great project run out of UCA College. It's actually out of the history department there, that they go and work with organizations to take their materials and do like a mass digitization. So they've done a lot of collections with like the Boy Scouts, the local Boy Scout organizations in their region, or the Utica Zoo. They have some great zoo materials that they went to the zoo and said, we would like to digitize your materials on your behalf and put them up. That's not as much like reaching out to individuals. So it makes it a little bit easier when you're reaching out to an organization, because then you're relying on materials that they already have. Individuals is where it gets really tricky. And I think that's, Claire, you shouldn't feel bad about not having that work. I think that's really common. People go in with great intentions, and it's really hard to do, because you have to find the right people with the right materials and get the word out effectively. And there's a lot of moving pieces for everything to line up. if there are any other questions, go ahead and type them now. Otherwise, we'll wrap up. I really appreciate such a great turnout, especially in the middle of the inauguration. And we will be recording this, or it is being recorded, and I plan to send it out later this week, hopefully, to all registrants. So if you had to step out for a minute or were otherwise not able to see the whole thing, I'll send it out. And hopefully we'll have more of these coming up. Thank you so much to Claire and to Ryan for your help, and stay tuned. Bye, everyone.